Hello everyone and welcome. This is the Japan Politics podcast. I'm your host Luke Whitaker. This is episode 2 of the show and entitled The Race to be Japan's Next Prime Minister. And today we're going to be talking about the election that just happened, Japan's 2024 election. We're going to be sort of analysing it, looking at the aftermath, what's going to happen next, thinking about who's done well, who hasn't done so well. And we're going to just generally be talking about what the state of play is now in Japan. And then we're going to delve on a bit just to generally see what might happen next. So I think first things first, we should look really at the results of the election. Turnout was down. I mean, that's imaginable. Generally, people, I think, were unhappy with the LDP in the wake of all these scandals. They weren't sure if there was a clear, realistic possibility of someone else taking their place. Some people didn't necessarily want a radical overhaul, but were generally dissatisfied. But yeah, turnout was down to 53.84%, and my prediction I made at the end of the last episode that the LDP would be bruised, they would lose seats, but they would most likely stay in power, possibly with a coalition having to help them out. Now, I think I perhaps underestimated how badly the LDP would do, but I think that broadly looks to be accurate. I think the LDP are in pole position still to lead a minority government just because of how disparate the opposition is. But yeah, let's go through the results. So LDP have gone from 259 to 191 seats, but that still leaves them with the most seats. And then the Constitution Party, who were looking to sort of move to the centre and were presenting themselves as the main challengers to the LDP and hoping to take their place in a perfect world, obviously on their own, but perhaps more realistically with a good seat share to lead a strong opposition coalition. They've gone from 96 to 148 seats, so we're up 52. And then you've got Ishin, I think slightly underperformed or didn't really make too much of an impact. They went from 41 to 38 seats, so lost 3, but that's still a substantial block. It could be very relevant in a divided parliament. And then the Democratic Party for Japan, they did, I think you'd say, Democratic Party for the People, you'd have to say they did quite well. They've gone from 11 seats to 28, so an uptick of 17. Very respectable, and I will talk about this later, but they could be very pivotal in the shape of what happens now with forming the next coalition, who's going to be the next Prime Minister of Japan. Komeito, very similar to the LDP, as we talked about last episode, the Buddhist party who were aligned to the LDP. And there's quite a few interesting things to come out of this, which I'll cover when we sort of go around in a bit more detail. They've lost 8 seats, gone from 32 to 24, so suffering very much off the dissatisfaction and the feeling that the coalition was weak and there was seats to be taken from them. They've suffered as a result of that. They've lost 1 in 4 seats. Reiwa, very respectable increase. The sort of the populist left-wing party, they've gone from 3 to 9, so it's given them a nice foothold. And Communist Party, in an interesting story, they've gone from 10 to 8, so declined by 2 despite the weakness of the LDP. I suppose perhaps people were looking for, really dissatisfied with the LDP. They were thinking, well, we want other parties who perhaps might be forming an opposition to do better, or perhaps it's just a small of change, that it's just one of those things. And the other parties to pick up seats were the Sanseito Party, the new quite right-wing populist party that started up. They won 3 seats, and the party I neglected to mention in the last episode, this new Conservative Party, they also picked up 3 seats. So they're quite interesting newcomers, which we'll talk about in a bit more depth when we go around the parties. And so that's what the layout of the parliament now is. So where does that leave things now? Well, LDP, as I say, are very much, despite being very bruised, their legitimacy and their claim to being the strong governing party of Japan has taken a big hit. But they're still very much the biggest game in town in terms of seats. They've got 215 when you take into account their coalition partner Komeito, and that leaves them, of course, short of the 233 you need to form a working majority. But the nature of their opposition is so splintered that to realistically get an opposition coalition together would be very difficult and would require everyone to go along, no one to work with the LDP, and for things to stay perfectly coordinated. And in politics, that's a very difficult thing to pull off. Not impossible, but if there was enough willpower, but very difficult. So state of play now is, I think, around the 11th of November, possibly. I don't think that's a date is set in stone, but sort of around then, there will be a vote to decide who will be the next Prime Minister. I believe that LDP, as the largest party, will have preference to go first. They'll be able to say, we want Ishiba as our leader to stay in, and Komeito, you would imagine, as a coalition partner, will vote with them, which takes them to 215. And they will now very much be scrambling to think, can we bring anyone along with us to get us to 233, which would secure a majority, would secure that Ishiba will stay in and will have the right to call himself Japan's next Prime Minister. Things, if they can't bring a coalition partner along, get rather more complicated. My understanding of how this works will be that the LDP will have their 215 votes down. They'll say that's the people willing to support Ishiba, but because it's short of 233, there'll then be a runoff vote where parties other than the LDP will have a chance to vote and say, we want our candidate to be Prime Minister. Now, in theory, if all the opposition parties were to line up and get to 233, that could very well happen. Say if they all rallied behind the Constitution, the next largest party, and said they could convince the DPP, Ishin, all the other parties to pull together. In theory, that could happen. The difficulty with this, of course, is it's very difficult. You'd have, like I say, every party is going to be out for their own interests. They're going to want certain things back from whoever they're going to support, and also they do not want to be seen negatively. They stood there and said, we believe we're the best party for Japan, we've got the best ideas, we want you to support us, and then to immediately just go and support another party that your voters decline to back, unless it goes well, does not look good for you. As we've just seen, Komeito's been punished. They've taken a bit of a loss through backing the LDP. Now, in theory, even if the five biggest parties, that's aside from the LDP and the Komeito, who are their coalition partners and are unlikely to switch sides, if the Constitution, Ishin, the Democratic Party for Japan, for people, the Communist Party, Reiwa, so the five biggest parties all pulled together, they would still only have 231 seats, so that leaves them two short. And then you'd be looking to parties like Komeito or these new Sanseito or the new Conservative Party, who, though they are seeking to take support from the LDP, it would be a strange look for them to go behind this opposition of a more left-wing party, having just run as sort of right-wing populist. So it's very hard for them to pull that off to get to a majority. Now, it might be, if in theory this were to happen, they could still win just because they'd have more votes than the LDP. But I just think it's so unlikely those five would work together or anything like that. I think the most likely outcome is that the LDP and Komeito will bring in their 215 votes, or if they're very effective, they'll be able to bring another party in with them if they're able to offer certain concessions, and that they'll say, we're now over the majority 233 needed, or they'll have their go, fail to get 233, the Constitution Party will have a go, fail to get more than them, and then I believe what happens is the party with the most votes, even if it doesn't get to the 233 majority, but the party whose coalition is able to get the most votes for their prime ministerial candidate will secure the position, which I think will probably be the LDP unless some dramatic shift in alliance broking and political games happens. But very interesting, and I think it's going to be a fascinating vote sort of around the 11th of November whenever that happens, and there's going to be a lot of talks between different parties. I believe the DPP is seen as very pivotal in this. They've got their new increased seats of around, I think it's, what did I say earlier, was it 38? 28, sorry. The DPFP, I'm disrespecting them already, have got their new increased majority of, not majority, but their new number of 28 seats. And I believe they've currently engaged in talks with the LDP and possibly other parties, but I think their position at the moment, and this has made other parties and pundits quite angry at them for this, I believe, or frustrated. Their position currently is they're planning to vote for their own leader or no one at all. They're not planning to support anyone, which obviously would frustrate Constitution, because by default that means the LDP is almost certainly without those extra 28 seats going into support at a rival. That means by default LDP will get in, with a minority government. Or it may be, if the LDP are very persuasive, that they will get a majority of the seats, and then the rival will get in. But I think the most likely outcome is that the LDP will get in, with a minority government. Or it may be, if the LDP are very persuasive, that they will get in, with a minority government. But I think the most likely outcome is that the LDP will get in, with a minority government. they might talk them into coming along. But I think the thing that's now in discussion is not so much them entering into a formal coalition, but the DPFP might support them on certain issues where they align, possibly to help them get certain priorities. So yeah, I think the more likely outcome is that they'll essentially go for on a policy by policy basis, and they'll look to offer DPFP certain things, and they'll agree where they can in order to get bills passed. So to get fiscal bills through the House and just generally get things rolling, they might come to some sort of informal or formal coalition agreement or policy by policy agreement where they'll support each other without actually entering into a coalition. So it'd be very interesting to see how those talks with the DPFP go. I think that will very much affect how much the LDP will be able to get done if they do enact a minority government, and if they were to enter into a coalition, obviously that would vastly affect things. It would require major concessions, but it will be interesting how much they can get them to cooperate without entering into a coalition agreement, what concessions might be required, and how effective this sort of minority government led by the LDP with possibly the DPFP, if they can be persuaded, supporting them on certain policies that line up with their manifesto and what they promised, will be able to get through. So it's very interesting how the DPFP, despite not being the biggest opposition party, is emerging as this sort of kingmaker role, sort of similar to the Lib Dems in the coalition they entered to with the Conservatives to keep Labour out of power, which I suppose makes sense. I mean, the biggest opposition, it's sort of seen as a big betrayal of their voters to enter into a coalition with their direct rivals, so it would be a smaller party, seen as a less big directly opposed opponent might be possibly finding areas to work with them, similar to how the Lib Dems did, although possibly the Lib Dems could have entered into a coalition with Labour to keep the Conservatives out, which perhaps their voters would have wanted more. But yeah, these are the sort of interesting things that happen when there's no clear majority and one sort of prominent but smaller than the biggest two parties can have that pivotal role. So it'd be very interesting to see what happens there. Now I'm going to go around the parties, look at how each one's done in detail, sort of think who's a winner, who's a loser, talk about sort of interesting stories that came out of the election, and just look at things in a little bit more detail. Now, we can't look at anyone other than the LDP first, of course, and they've very obviously, you would have to say, are losers. I mean, the main thing you could say for them is that despite these scandals, despite Ishiba calling this sort of surprise snap election, which you could compare to Sunak calling an election early, Sunak in the UK calling an early election and costing his party governance, despite a lot of people urging him in the UK, or the Conservative people to urge him to hold on from things a lot more favourable. Ishiba did something very similar. He said, I've only just got in power, perhaps I can treat things as a new slate, or perhaps I just have to call an election in order to be able to get on with things and to get out of sort of being mired in scandal and talking about factionalism within my party. I just have to call a line under things to move on. Or perhaps he thought he's seen as an outsider, new face, he's coming in, maybe people will think about historically, they'll sort of revert to the mean of their old opinion of the LDP over the years rather than what they think of them right now in the event of these scandals. If you call a snap election, force people to think about it very rapidly, like who do you really want governing you? And now that the leader who previously perhaps you didn't like as much has been removed and I'm this new face in charge, the best thing you could say for them is, in a sense, although theoretically all the parties could pull together to keep them out of power, most likely they're going to still stay in power. It certainly would make them a much bigger loser if they were to somehow fail to get anyone to enter into coalition with them and also fail to prevent all the opposition parties coalescing together to keep them out of power. That would be pretty dramatic and really make the election look in a poor light for them. But I suppose in a sense it is just difficult, isn't it, for the LDP? They've lost 68 seats, they've lost their majority, but they are still in power. And in a sense, although they're very much fraught by factionalism, in a way there are some minor positives for Ishiba, because the Abe faction, who he was looking to move on from and who were mired in all these slush fund scandals, the Abe faction has suffered a big blow. It was many of their candidates who've suffered as a result of this, which might help them to sort of move on from the scandal and help Ishiba potentially, or if it's not Ishiba, another centre-right candidate, keep control of the party rather than letting the Abe faction back into power. And this reminds me quite a bit, I keep mentioning UK politics, of when Boris Johnson brought in lots of sort of pro-Brexit Northern MPs. When he was ousted and then Sunak lost the election badly, it was many of them who lost their seats. And the result is that the Tory party is possibly a little bit less right-wing as a result, because many of the Tories that held onto this were sort of centre-right. The same thing seems to have happened in Japan. Many of the Abe faction were not endorsed by the LDP, and they've lost their seats. Now, it might seem on the face of it that with Ishiba struggling, having suffered an election loss, that Takeichi, who we talked about in the last episode, who lost this runoff election to Ishiba, she at first was the front runner to take over the LDP and be the one potentially leading the LDP into a new election. She lost through subsequent rounds as support went to Ishiba. You might think that she might be waiting in the wings, thinking, I've been validated to an extent, I've shown that Ishiba was the wrong man because he lost the election, or certainly lost seats. But because many of these Abe people have been, Abe-aligned politicians have been ousted in the election, that sort of weakens her hands, because many of those have now gone, and that's her support base is gone, and that sort of might help Ishiba or another centre-right candidate to hold on to the future of the LDP. And so maybe, though things look very fraught within the LDP still, despite factions being disbanded, despite, as I say, sort of many Abe politicians losing their seats, things are still quite fraught there. But this may play into the fact that there's not an obvious successor at the moment for Ishiba, or that it weakens someone who you might think would be in an obvious place to take power from him, has now been weakened as a result of sort of the fallout of that election. So that's one of the big, I suppose you could say, positives for Ishiba. It will help him hold on, and he's still by default there as the most likely person to take power. But I think you've lost 68 seats. You can't say anything other than you're a loser. You've lost your majority. So I think you'd have to call the LDP one of the losers of the election overall, despite all those mitigating things I've said about them. Now, of course, second, who else could you talk about than the second party now in Japan, CDP, the Constitution Party? They're absolutely winners. I mean, I talked last episode about how certain people were saying that it was the fact that they moved sort of their party into a more centre position, where they're traditionally seen as a bit more left-wing. It sort of upset their traditional arrangements they had with parties like the Communist Party, and it may have confused where they were in the electoral system. And happily, though, for the Constitution Party, it would appear that this gamble has absolutely paid off for them. They've won many seats as a result. It's validated the strategic decision they've made, and they can now say clearly that they are the real alternative in this parliament to the LDP. If you want something other than the LDP in government, which many voters appear to have gone out for, the Constitution Party is the natural people to rally around and have the first try to replace them in government. And as I say, they've very much been rewarded for this. They've gone from 96 up to 148 seats, a plus of 52 seats. That gives them a very substantial voting bloc. And yeah, I think you have to call them a winner as a result. They're definitely one of the biggest winners, if not the biggest winner of this election. And I think the only thing that you could say to temper that is the proof now remains to be in the pudding. What are the Constitution Party actually going to do with these votes? They've got a real chance to present themselves as a thorn in the LDP side. And I think the electorate's going to be looking for the next turn, because I think this could be a very fraught parliament. Whoever governs is going to have a difficult time getting votes through. I think it's going to be, even if a coalition that gives a party a majority is formed, it's going to be difficult. If a government has to act as a minority government, even more so. And I think there's going to be a lot of difficult times ahead in terms of votes, how the factions line up. And I think the parties are going to have to perform and back up the fact that they claimed they could be in opposition to the LDP, they could rein them in, and that they could perform. And I think people are going to now have to see how the Constitution Party do, either in challenging the LDP if that's what they feel should be their biggest priority, or trying to act as a government, or will things simply just be chaotic? Who knows? But I think it's going to be fascinating how they perform. But you have to, for the moment, just on that electoral performance, call them a big winner of this election. Next up, you have to look at Ishin. Now, as I say, they have struggled to make a big impact. They have targeted themselves as this sort of right-wing reformist party that are hoping to pitch themselves as an opposition to the LDP, a potential new government, and they, despite the struggling the LDP has had, they've just not broken through. They've gained a slightly increased share in terms of percentage swing, and they've gone up by 2.79 to 11.15, but they've declined in the regional vote round, and they've lost 3 seats. They've gone from 41 down to 38, a decline of 3. So not a big change either way, but they haven't made a big impact to sort of profit on the decline of the LDP. So it's sort of hard to sort of gauge. They are a very serious voting bloc still. You know, it's not like they've suffered a defeat. You know, they're very much still breathing. They're very relevant given how close this parliament is, and it'll be interesting to see what they look to do with that, whether they're just seeking to undermine the LDP at every opportunity, whether they're seeking to form a coalition with someone, and how they'll carry themselves going forward. But they've not a clear, there's not a sort of a clear victory in this, so it seems harsh to call them a loser off the back of losing 3 seats, but possibly. I think a big story that has to be told, though, is the way in which they've specifically taken on Komeito, the LDP, as coalition partner in Osaka Prefecture. And I think there's a very interesting minor story there to be told. But in order to illustrate this, I think I now have to move on to Komeito, LDP's junior partner in coalition, who, like I say, I think you have to view through the frame of a loser as well, I'm afraid. In many respects, they've suffered as a result of the LDP. They've sort of been judged for their coalition, it would seem, in the voters' eyes, and as a result, they've lost seats. So yeah, as I say, they've lost 1 in 4 of their seats, which is a hammer blow as a result of being judged negatively by the electorate. They've gone from 32 to 24, a decline of 8, so 1 in 4 of their seats is gone. And I think there's a very interesting story to be told in the Osaka Prefecture, as I mentioned. Essentially what happened is the leader of Komeito, and a big part of them, me judging them as losers, is the fact that their leader's also, as a result of this election, been ousted. He's lost his seat. And the way this happened is that the leader, Kaiichi Ishii, I apologise again, terrible pronunciations as they occur, he could have chosen, and I'll have to briefly explain the way the Japanese electoral system works, which I'm still a little bit getting my head around, but there's an element where I believe you vote first for your local representative when you vote in Japan, and secondly you vote for the party. So you might vote for an individual person who could be of a particular party, and then you'll vote for the party you want to win overall. And so some representatives will be chosen based on those local prefecture votes of who people wanted to represent them locally, and some will be the party will take the amount of votes they've got from that second vote of who people chose as their preferred party, and they'll say, okay, here's our list of preferred candidates. So say, for example, Komeito gets 50% of Japan's votes, and they get, as a result, they get allotted so many seats off that from the second vote. They'll go down the list and pick their preferred candidates. Now, my understanding is Ishii could possibly have chosen to put himself on that list, which would, you'd imagine, sort of on average, you'd get so many votes for your party. You'd expect as the leader, you'd be not guaranteed, but looking very favourably likely to get a seat. As the leader of a major party in Japan, you'd perhaps be the first name on the list, and you wouldn't have to win or lose in any one particular area. But he decided not to do that. He decided he was going to fight a particular seat which was looking competitive in the election, and as a result, he's been unseated, which is a big blow for Komeito, and it's also the fact that because it was such a tightly run race, it seems like he was very tied up there and he couldn't go around in the surrounding areas to campaign. And so I believe there's been a number of losses in Osaka for Komeito. And part of this is because Ishin, the previous party I mentioned, previously they had like a local sort of cooperation where they wouldn't step on each other's toes, and they wouldn't stand candidates against each other, because they thought they might be drawing from the same voter pool possibly, or things just wouldn't work out well. But I think Ishin decided, and in this I think despite them overall not doing too well, they've played an absolute blinder. They decided to tear that up, challenge them in Osaka, and as a result they've won a number of seats from them in that area, which has badly damaged Komeito and played an absolute blinder, as I say, for Ishin locally. So I think, despite the fact they've lost 3 seats, I'm always tempted to upgrade them to a winner as a result, but it's just one of those. I think it's a very interesting local play, and it just shows how these things are all like, it's not just an overall countrywide story, who wins, who loses. There's very much local tactics and sort of thin margins at play in terms of how these numbers are made up. And as a result of this, in the Osaka region, Komeito won only 2 of 6 electoral districts, which is a decline on their support in that area, and Ishin has benefited from this. So yeah, that's an interesting sort of local side story there for you of the election. Moving on, I think next we have to talk about the DPFP, the Democratic Party for the People. They are brought up already, really are very much kingmakers just because of the way the party seem to line up, who's willing to talk to who, who's unwilling to work with who, and who's got that key number of seats and the way things have played out. As I've said, they've done very well in terms of the raw electoral result. They've increased their share of the vote in both counts. Both the constituency and the regional votes have gone up, and they've gone from 11 up by 17 to 28 seats. And I think they have a very strong position. They're going to be on a lot of pressure by a lot of people in a lot of directions, just because of the way things have worked out to support certain people and to use their new power in a certain way. And we'll perhaps judge them in time on how they play that. But at the moment, they've done an absolute blinder. I think perhaps one of the biggest winners of this election, if not the biggest, alongside the Constitution Party, in terms of they're now so much more prominent in people's minds as a result of this pivotal role. They've increased their seats, which is a base possibly to build on in the future. But as I say, the only thing you temper that with is, like with the Constitution Party, how are they going to play this? How will things look? How will people judge them on how they use the trust that's been put in them, the amount of seats they have? How do they utilise it? But that will only tell in time. But for now, you have to call them massive, massive winners as a result of this. And then rounding out, you have Reiwa, the left-wing populist party, have gone from 3 seats to 9 and have also gone up in both electoral counts. They're perhaps not big enough to swing or to be seen like the DPFP as like a must-have, and perhaps because they're sort of this left-wing populist, they're a little bit outside the mainstream sort of centre-right, centrist, centre-left bloc. They're not being courted or seen as a playmaker in quite the same way as DPFP, but I think that's a very respectable vote for them. It's shown that this brand of politics they've employed has paid off, and it's put them in a much more prominent position to go from 3 to 9, and it's a nice sort of springboard they could potentially build on. So I think things look very promising for them if they can sort of use that platform to really hammer their policy platform and make themselves a little bit more prominent going forward. And it's something very interesting for them to build on. So yeah, I think you don't very much have to call them winners as a result. And yeah, be interesting what they do with that and how they look to build on that in the future. The Communist Party, I think you'd have to call losers of this election. They've declined from 10 to 8 seats. That's also a fifth of their support gone. Although you're not particularly seeing a massive swing. They've declined in the regional vote, but their constituency vote went up. You can't say too much about that really. That's sort of swings and misses. It's not a particularly big change to lose 2 seats, but again, they've really not, like Ishin, they've really not capitalised on the falling popularity of the LDP, and put themselves forward as the most prominent opposition voice, and they haven't captured the imagination the way the Constitution Party have, and they haven't seen the same dramatic growth that parties like Reiwa increasing by threefold and the DPFP growing dramatically. They just haven't had that same sort of success, and in fact they declined despite challenging a unpopular governing party. And also they, like I say, this cooperation they in the past had to some degree with the Constitution Party. You might think contesting more seats, refusing to cooperate with them, they'd be looking to capitalise in certain areas, but it seems really that the Constitution Party are the ones who gained in the equation out of that, rather than the communists. So I think you'd have to call them, the oldest party in Japan, a big loser of this election. Next up is Sanseito, who I talked about last time. I sort of made parallels about them possibly being the answer to Japan of reform in the UK, or sort of a similar sort of trend of parties, of these new right-wing populist parties. And I said I'd be very interested to see how they did in particular. They've gained 3 seats, nothing to sneeze at as a sort of a first start for a party. In the past, new parties have entered as a first try in Japan and done better than that, got bigger results. But we've just seen Reiwa gone from 3 to 9 seats, so perhaps this is a bit of a springboard for them. And I think to go from perhaps this is my UK perspective thinking, but to go from a new party to immediately gaining seats seems like a solid achievement. So you'd have to call them a winner of this election. With that perspective in mind, they've got their foot in the door with 3 seats, despite fielding 95 candidates. And in terms of the constituency and the block votes, they got over 1 million, I think around 1.3 in one and 1.8, close to 1.9 in the other. I think you'd have to say they've got their foot in the door, and it's now just remains to be seen, as with so many other parties, how can they build on that now they're a player in parliament in Japan's diet. And I think it could be interesting if they entertain any sort of thought of a coalition at all, because with 3 votes, obviously they're not pivotal, but could be important given the very thin margins. Will they choose to possibly work with the LDP, who are centre-right, or would they see that too much as sort of a betrayal of their voter base, they very much pitch themselves as a further right alternative, very much distinct from the LDP? And so would they see that as a betrayal, or would it be seen as better to work with a right-wing party of some description in the LDP rather than letting them fail in government? I'd be very interested to see how they play that, if they're open at all to any sort of cooperation. Perhaps they might support certain bills the LDP put forward that they might see as going well with their base, or whether they refuse to take part and sort of just continue pitching their right-wing populist alternative and saying we represent a new approach. So be interesting to see what that 3-seat voter bloc does in the parliament very much, and to see where they go from here, whether they grow like Reiwa, and how that plays out in the future. Another party who I neglected to mention in the last one, and that's my mistake, is the Conservative Party of Japan, who are another very new party, I believe founded about a year ago. And I think you'd put them very in a similar bracket to Sanseito. They're sort of a right-wing populist movement, and sort of targeting themselves as a sort of an alternative to the LDP, of I suppose what you'd call a more conservative, more right-wing party, and offering that as an alternative to voters rather than sticking with this centre-right LDP. And they've very much benefited, similar to Sanseito. They've grown and they've got their foot in the door with, again, 3 votes. And I think the same comments to Sanseito apply, whether they go along with the LDP or whether they stay on their own and seek to grow their message. The biggest thing that stands out to them is their leader, Naoki Hayakutu, and I apologise for mispronunciation, as it applies. He's a sort of a pundit commentator on political issues, novelist, who's transitioned that into now founding his own political party. And he wrote the novel Eternal Zero, which was made into a film, and which is interesting. We've seen it before, novelists becoming politicians, but it's an interesting transition when people go from, like the leader of Reiwa, from sort of media into politics. And lastly, we have to round up with the Social Democratic Party, who won 1 seat. I sort of missed them, so I apologise for that. They previously had 1 seat, and they still have 1 seat, but I've noticed they've declined overall in the vote, I believe. So I think you'd have to call that also a loss. They have for Japan, you'd have to say a decent history going back to 1996 as a sort of a socialist party, the Socialist Democratic Party, as you'd imagine. But they've gone from a height of around 19 seats to now only holding on to 1 in the last election. You'd think this might, again, for a smaller party, be a chance to break through, as others have, like Reiwa, but that seems to have passed the SDP by. They haven't captured any ground, really. They've declined a vote, and they've only held on to the same seat, or only held on to 1 seat, I should say. Again, I'm afraid you'd have to call them a loser of this election's result, which rounds up the go-round of the parties. So that rounds out the sort of the go-round of the election results party by party. And we've looked at 1 or 2 interesting stories, like I say, the sort of the byplay in Osaka of Ishin versus Komeito, the way the fallout of the LDP has affected the prospects of future leaders, that now, because of the Abe faction declining, that could also impact future leadership elections in the LDP. Another interesting fact I noticed is that there's now a record number of women in Japan's parliament. A record 73 were elected, which is about 16%, and this seems low coming from a UK perspective. I believe the global average is about 27, I read. I believe that's come about in the UK partly because of all-female lists. I believe Blair had this in the Labour Party, and you also saw David Cameron introduce this to sort of encourage more women to take up roles in Parliament and to sort of make things a bit more balanced in that respect, which has had, I believe, a big impact to the numbers in the UK being much higher than that. So as far as I'm aware, there's not anything like that in Japan, which would... it would be interesting to see what the numbers were in UK before or female shortlists were introduced, or sort of the active encouragement to sort of bring that balance versus what Japan has now. But nonetheless, that's, like I say, a record, so I think it's worth mentioning. And it'd be interesting to see if that's because the LDP's lost a number of seats and sort of newer parties have seen growth, and they've brought in female candidates to make up for that increase, to make a record number. And it will be very interesting to see if that's sort of a trend that will play out in the future, or if it's or just to see generally how it changes in the next election, as this is, in many ways, there's been a lot of change in this election, and so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out from here. And so that rounds up the political segment of the show. I suppose that leads me on to any other business or any other Japanese news that's not politics, on a bit of a lighter note. And I guess the main thing on my mind is the Japan series in baseball, which I follow very slightly. I'm not a fan by any means, but I like to watch it when I'm over there. I'll go to the odd game, and sometimes I follow it mainly. I've got friends who are into it, and I believe that it's now confirmed that Dena Baystars have won the postseason game, and so they've now won. The Dena Baystars have won their first Japan Series title in 26 years, which is a big achievement for them in the postseason. So well done to them. That's a big record for them to break, 26 years. And I believe they finished 3rd in the table, but got into the postseason on the back of that. I believe it was the Yomiuri Giants, I think it is, and the Hanshin Tigers who finished 1st and 2nd. So to come from finishing 3rd in the table over the season to then get into the postseason and win that is a very big achievement for them. So well done. Be interesting to see how they follow that up in the year in the league next year, and see what happens from there. But yeah, that about rounds up the podcast, guys. That's all I've got to talk about. But thank you so much for listening. And again, if you're listening to this on YouTube, you can listen to it on iTunes and vice versa. That's the Japan Politics Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Sayonara, goodbye.